soft orchestral strings. A single candle flame. Then, the image of a young woman walking across a cobblestone courtyard, her dark hair catching the September wind. There's a photograph, not a famous one, not the one the newspapers printed, a small, slightly blurred photograph taken by a fellow student with a disposable camera in the autumn of 2001. In it, a girl is laughing. Not posing. Not performing. Just laughing. At something someone said. At nothing. At everything. She doesn't know she's being photographed. She doesn't know, standing there in that grey Scottish courtyard with her second-hand scarf and her coffee going cold, that in 4 years her face would be in every newspaper on the planet. She doesn't know any of it yet. And that, maybe, is exactly why he fell. Sound of wind off the North Sea. The creak of an old stone building. A kettle. St. Andrews is not a forgiving place in September. Anyone who tells you Scotland is romantic in autumn has never actually stood in it. The wind comes off the sea like it has a personal grievance with you. The stone buildings hold the cold the way old houses hold their dead, quietly, thoroughly, without apology. The students who arrive every September at the University of St. Andrews understand this within 24 hours of unpacking their bags. Catherine Middleton understood it within 20 minutes. She'd grown up in Berkshire. Green hedgerows, church fêtes, the kind of England that still exists in children's picture books. The daughter of a self-made family, her parents had built a business from their kitchen table, mailing party supplies across the country. There was money now, but it was earned money, and Catherine carried that in her spine. Straight. Quiet. No performance required. She arrived at St. Andrews to read history of art. She arrived, also, with a suitcase that was one size too large for the dorm room, a stack of books she'd already half-read, and the sort of composure that some people mistake for coldness and others recognize immediately as strength. Her flatmate at the time, a girl from Edinburgh named Sarah, who now teaches primary school and declined to be interviewed for this documentary, described her simply: Kate was the kind of person you trusted before you knew why. You did. The town of St. Andrews sits on a peninsula where the North Sea and the Eden estuary meet, as if the land itself couldn't decide which direction to face. 12,000 residents. One of the oldest universities in the English-speaking world. And, every few years, a small intake of students who arrive not under their own names but under arrangements made quietly, carefully, by people paid to be careful. That September, one of those students was William Wales. He was not yet 20. He had spent the previous year in Chile and Belize, doing what his family's people called a gap year and, what he would later describe, in one of his first major interviews, as trying to find out what I was like when nobody was watching. He arrived at St. Andrews also to read history of art. This was not a coincidence designed by anyone. It was simply history of art. Them was looking for the other. That's the thing. William was trying very hard to be just another student, which is nearly impossible when you have 2 protection officers sitting 4 tables away pretending to read Kafka. And, Catherine, she was focused. She was serious. She was not the sort of girl who looked up every time a door opened. They were in the same year. Same subject. The first time they were in a room together, neither of them remembered it. That's the thing about beginnings. They don't announce themselves. What Catherine remembered, and what she described, years later, to friends who later described it to journalists who later described it to the world, was not a first conversation, or a first glance, or any of the things that get written up as the start of love stories. What she remembered was a room full of people she didn't know yet, and a seat near a window because the radiator was broken, and thinking that this room smelled like every old building she'd ever been in, chalk dust and damp stone and something almost like wood polish, and feeling, for the first time, properly away from home. Not lonely. Just away. And choosing to be. William, by all accounts, spent his first weeks doing what people who are famous from birth learn to do, watching the room without appearing to. He would later describe St. Andrews as the first place in his life where people, eventually, stopped treating him like a symbol. Eventually. Cut to a street in St. Andrews. Rain beginning. A shop window. The town wraps itself around the university the way a hand cups a flame. Bakeries that open at 6 in the morning. A pub where the same men have sat at the same stools since before most of the students were born. A bookshop where the owner knows your degree by the third time you come in. It is the kind of place that keeps secrets, partly by geography and partly by temperament. And, for two people who were, in wildly different ways, in need of a place that knew how to keep quiet, it was, perhaps, exactly right. I shared a seminar with both of them. Second semester of first year. I remember noticing not any single moment, just noticing that they always ended up in the same conversation clusters. You know how in seminars people form these little groups? They were always in the same one. And they'd go at it not romantically, just intellectually. They disagreed about things. Catherine was not the type to nod along. That was noticeable. Most people nodded along. There is a moment that has been written about so many times now that it has acquired the strange, compressed quality of legend, flattened by repetition, certain details calcified into fact, others quietly dropped. The moment is this: a charity fashion show. St. Andrews. March 2002. The show was organized by the student union to raise money for a local cause, a small event, a runway made of pushed-together tables, the lighting handled by a third year with access to a box of colored gels. The sort of thing that would have been entirely unremarkable had it not contained, walking that makeshift runway in a sheer black dress over a black bikini, Catherine Middleton. She was 20 years old. She did not hesitate at the end of the runway. She turned, easy as breathing, and walked back. A beat of near silence. The music drops to just strings. William was in the front row. He'd bought a ticket for the show. The price was £5, which he'd later describe as the best £5 he'd ever spent, and he was sitting in that audience with the easy, practiced posture of someone who has been trained from childhood to appear comfortable in every situation. The posture, by all accounts, left him entirely when Catherine walked out. A friend who was sitting beside him, a Scottish boy named Fergus, who has never spoken publicly and, we were unable to reach, reportedly leaned over to him immediately afterward and said something that cannot be broadcast on the BBC. William, according to everyone who was there, said nothing. He watched the whole show. He watched it the way you watch something you aren't sure yet how to process, with your whole face still, your hands quiet, your body slightly forward without quite knowing it has moved. The professor again. The fashion show story gets very reductive very fast. People focus on the dress. And, yes, apparently the dress was remarkable, from what I understand. But, what those who were there describe is something else. They describe a young woman who was entirely, serenely unaware of the effect she was having. Which is, well, that's the thing, isn't it? That was always the thing with her. Fade to the sound of wind. The North Sea again. He sought her out afterward. Not that evening. Not the next morning. 3 days later, in the dining hall, he sat down across from her and said, and this is verified, as much as anything in a private life can be verified, nothing particularly spectacular. Something about the seminar they were both about to miss. A question about readings. She answered him the same way she would have answered anyone. That, he would later tell friends, was the thing. By the end of that first year, they were friends. Not yet anything other than that. But, friends, in the particular way that friendship at that age works, a series of accumulated hours, shared meals, conversations that started practical and ended somewhere else entirely. The protection officers learned Catherine's face and stopped tracking her as an unknown. She learned which questions William deflected and stopped asking them, not because she was performing sensitivity but because she had, simply, worked him out. There is a photograph from that June taken by someone at a party, on the kind of night that university friendships are made and sealed, in which they are standing in a garden. Not touching. Not looking at each other. Both of them laughing at the same thing, off to the left. The same thing. Off to the left. It is not a romantic photograph. It is something quieter than that. It is two people who have begun, without quite naming it, to occupy the same version of the world. There is a particular kind of intimacy that only shared houses produce. Not romance. Not yet. Just the intimacy of someone else's kettle habits. Their 3 a.m. fridge raids. The specific way they leave their wet umbrella on the wrong hook and never seem to notice it's the wrong hook. You can know someone's history and still not know them. Not really. Not the way you know them when you have shared a bathroom and a lounge and a freezer with exactly one bag of oven chips left in it that no one will admit to. That was Hope Street. That was where the real story started. Number 13 Hope Street does not look like the birthplace of anything. It looks like what it is, a student house in a Scottish seaside town. 3 stories, slightly damp in the walls, a sitting room where one of the lamps never quite worked and no one ever fixed it. A kitchen with a table that wobbled unless you wedged a folded beer mat under the left rear leg. That autumn, Catherine Middleton moved in. So did William. Along with 2 other students, a boy from Devon and a girl from Fife, they formed the kind of household that university years produce and adult life dismantles, provisional, loud in patches, comfortable in a way that has nothing to do with furniture. The protection officers were in a flat nearby. They had been briefed on the other housemates. The arrangement had been, quietly, cleared. What nobody briefed for was chemistry. The thing with Kate, she never talked about it. Her friends knew, by about November, that something was happening. But she didn't talk about it. She's not a girl who processes things by talking. She processes things by going very quiet and very still, and then coming out the other side already decided. She'd already made her decision before anyone else had finished asking the question. What happened between September and December 2002 happened the way most real things happen, not dramatically, but by accumulation. A Tuesday afternoon where the other 2 housemates were away and there was nothing for it but to cook something and eat it at that wobbly table, and the conversation went until 10 o'clock when it had started at 5. A walk along the coastal path one Saturday when the sky was doing something extraordinary, grey dissolving into white, dissolving into a gold that had no business being there in November, and they'd both stopped without saying anything, looking at the same horizon. The small cataloging of preferences that happens when 2 people are paying attention to each other without admitting they're doing it. He took his coffee black. She put the milk in first. He read the last page of books before he started them. She found this mildly criminal and told him so. These are not significant events. They only feel significant from the outside. From the inside, at the time, they were just a Wednesday. Just a walk. Just an argument about whether reading the last page first is cheating or pragmatic. What Catherine had, and what the people who knew her best will describe in almost identical terms, was a quality that is harder to perform than intelligence, harder to fake than kindness. She was patient. Not passive. Not waiting. Patient the way deep water is patient, not still, but not agitated. Moving in ways that aren't visible from the surface. She understood, intuitively, what William's life cost him. Not the palaces. Not the obligations, the schedules, the way a room changed temperature when he walked into it. Not the machinery of it. The cost of never quite being off. Of wearing your public self so constantly that you occasionally forget you have another one. She didn't mention it. She just made a space where he could put it down for an evening. What strikes me, looking back at that period, 2002, 2003, is how deliberately ordinary it was. And I don't mean that dismissively. I mean they worked it ordinary. They protected it. They went to the same pub. They cooked at home. They didn't go to London on weekends when other students did. There was something conscious about staying inside the smallness of St. Andrews. I think they both understood that what they were building needed quiet. Needed time without cameras, without family expectation, without the machinery warming up around them. She pauses. Adjusts her reading glasses on the desk in front of her. The machinery was coming. They both knew it. But, not yet. Before they did, in the week before the end of term, in the kitchen that smelled of toast and whoever's turn it was to use the cleaning spray and hadn't something shifted. The exact details of what passed between them in that week belonged to them and only them. This is not a failure of the documentary. It is, in fact, the only appropriate response to two people who chose, with great deliberateness, to keep their private life private. What we know is this: when the new year began and the second semester started and they returned to Hope Street, they returned as something different. Not different to look at. Not broadcasting anything. But different in the specific, unambiguous way that people who share a house know, because you feel the shift in how someone hands you a cup of tea. Because the distance across a kitchen shrinks. Because laughter arrives 2 beats faster than it used to. I saw Kate in January. First week back. And I knew. I didn't ask. She wouldn't have answered. But I knew because she was lighter isn't the right word. More settled. Like something she'd been carrying very carefully had found a proper place to go. There is a story, told, retold, impossible to verify and yet consistent across enough accounts that it has earned a place here, about an evening in February 2003. A group of students. A pub. The ordinary equipment of a university night, ships going cold, someone's birthday, a round that took too long. At some point in the evening, someone, no one seems to remember who, made a comment. A joke, probably. The kind of thing said without thinking, the kind of careless remark that people make about other people when they don't believe those people are really listening. The comment was about Catherine. Specifically about whether someone like her, a commoner, would last. Whether she understood what she was getting into. Whether she was serious, or just dazzled. William, by all accounts, said nothing. He set down his drink. He looked at the person who'd said it. And then, he said, very quietly, and only once, something that made that person look at the table and not look up again for the rest of the evening. No one has reported the exact words. No one will. But everyone who was present has said, independently and in separate accounts, the same thing about his tone. Protecting someone is one thing. Meaning it is another. I think by early 2003, he meant it. That changes everything. When a Windsor means something, the whole weight of that institution moves behind it. Catherine, I suspect, felt that shift. You don't miss it. They stayed at St. Andrews for 2 more years. Not without difficulty. Not without the first tremors of what was coming, a photograph taken on a ski trip that ended up in a newspaper, the machinery warming its engines, a journalist seen in the town. Not without, also, the ordinary difficulties of 2 young people who were also 2 very specific young people with very specific histories working out how to share a life or the beginning of one. But they stayed. They studied. They walked the same coastal path in the same wind. He still read the last page first. She still found it mildly criminal. They graduated in June 2005, together. In the photographs from that day, they stand with their families, his considerably more documented than hers, in their gowns on the same grey Scottish stone, squinting into a rare bright June afternoon. They are both smiling. Not performing smiles. Just smiling. Hope Street. The wobbly table, the one lamp that never worked, the wrong umbrella hook. Love does not always announce itself from a balcony. Sometimes it happens in a kitchen. Sometimes it happens over the last bag of oven chips. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, if you're patient, if you make a space quiet enough for something real to grow, it holds. Music settles into something unresolved. Neither ending nor beginning. The light on screen doesn't fade. It just stays. The world does not wait. You can build something quiet and careful and real in a small grey town on the Scottish coast, and the world will not care. The world has its own schedule. Its own appetite. And it had been waiting since 2002, since the first photograph, since the first name printed in a gossip column, for the moment when the quiet careful thing became something it could consume. By 2005, the waiting was over. Catherine Middleton walked out of St. Andrews with a degree in history of art, a composure that had been tested and held, and a future that was suddenly, irrevocably, public. She had not auditioned for this. She had never stopped walking toward it. London is a different animal from St. Andrews. St. Andrews gave them the gift of smallness. London offers no such gift. William was posted with the military. Catherine was working in London, first in a fashion accessories company, later in her family business, the kind of sensible quiet work that would have been entirely unremarkable in anyone else's life and was, in hers, regularly photographed from across the street by men with very long lenses. The photographers had learned her walk. They knew the coffee shop. They knew the route. They positioned themselves before she arrived. She learned to move through it, not to ignore it, because you can't truly ignore something that is physically following you, but to carry it in such a way that it didn't bend her. She had a quality I've only seen in people who've had real training. She never showed them what they wanted. Not once. They wanted fear. They wanted her to flinch. They wanted the perfect shot of her face crumbling. They never got it. And, I can tell you, that is not easy. That is work. Whatever people think about Catherine, that composure was built, not born. In April 2007, they separated. It was reported everywhere within hours. The word split in headlines. Photographs of Catherine appearing at events, composed, the face that had been trained. The speculation was immediate and merciless and wrong in most of its details and not entirely wrong in its understanding that something had fractured. This is not a documentary that will pretend otherwise. Something fractured. 2007 it's the hinge of the whole story, really. Without it, the engagement in 2010 means something different. Without the break, you don't understand the choosing. And, I think that's important, they chose each other. Twice. The second time knowing exactly what the first choice had cost. She pauses. William was 24. He was going into the military full-time. He was working out, in a very private and very difficult way, what his life was going to ask of him. Those are not small questions when you're 24. They are not small questions when you're the person who will one day be king. Another pause. She chooses her next words with visible care. Catherine, I think, understood what he needed to do. She didn't collapse. She didn't perform devastation for the cameras. She was, I keep coming back to this word, patient. Which is extraordinary. Which is, frankly, one of the more remarkable acts of emotional intelligence I've ever seen from someone that young under that kind of scrutiny. A long shot of London. The Thames. The grey sky that could be any day, any season. What Catherine did in those months, and people who were close to her then, are consistent about this, was refuse to become defined by waiting. She was not waiting. She was living. She was working. She was with her friends. She was at parties where she laughed at actual things and not for cameras. She was on holiday in Ibiza in photographs that showed, undeniably, that she was not sitting in a corner somewhere quietly devastated. She was 25 years old, and she was, in that very particular word again, settled. Everyone kept asking her how she was, in that loaded way people do when they want you to fall apart in front of them. And she'd say fine, really fine, and mean it in a way that confused people. Like it confused people that she wasn't destroyed. But Kate was never someone who built herself around another person. Not even him. She was always herself first. That's not cold. That's just who she is. By the summer of 2007, they were, quietly, in each other's orbit again. Not announced. Not photographed in any way that confirmed it. Just glimpsed. The same party. The same country house weekend. The protection officers knew. The families, presumably, knew in the way that families know things they are not yet permitted to say aloud. What had changed, and this is the part that the people who know them describe as essential, was that they came back differently. Not younger, careless, romantic differently. Something harder-edged and better made than that. She was not the same girl who'd moved into Hope Street with the too large suitcase. He was not the same boy who'd sat in the front row of a charity fashion show and gone very still. They were, both of them, people who had chosen the hard version of something because the easy version wouldn't have been real. When they got back together, and I can tell you the mood changed immediately, I mean immediately, you felt it in the room, it was different. Calmer. They moved around each other differently. Less tentative. Like two people who'd decided something and weren't still deciding. The decision had been made. You could feel it. St. James's Park. Late afternoon. October. Leaves beginning. 2008 went by. William was flying. Literally, he was training with the RAF, learning to fly search and rescue helicopters, doing the practical unglamorous work of a military career that was also, quietly, the work of someone learning to be solid. To be useful. To be a person before he was a symbol. Catherine was photographed at charity events. At her family's home in Berkshire. At weddings of friends. She was, in the language of tabloids, increasingly confident in her public role, which is newspaper shorthand for, she had learned to walk into a room full of cameras and remain entirely herself. Not performed calm. Actual calm. Which are, as any person who has ever been genuinely afraid knows, completely different things. I think what people miss even now, looking back, is that it wasn't a fairy tale. That's the thing. Fairy tales happen to people. This happened because of people. Because of who she chose to be when it would have been so much easier to be something softer or more obvious or more accommodating. She never accommodated herself out of existence. And I think that's why it worked. And why it's going to keep working felt entirely real at the exact same moment. That she kept looking at the ring and then looking at the mountain and then back at the ring. Later, in the engagement interview, asked whether she'd been nervous, whether he had been nervous, she would say, with that smile that people spend a great deal of time analyzing and never quite succeeding at, he didn't get down on one knee, but he was very romantic. The composure is still there. But so is the smile. And if you know how to look, if you followed the 9 years, the fashion show, the kitchen, the wobbly table, the break, the coming back, the mountain in Kenya, if you know where to look, in the smile is the whole thing. The whole, true, unsentimental, hard-earned, utterly real. William Arthur Philip Lewis and Catherine Elizabeth Middleton announced their engagement to the world on November 16, 2010. They were married at Westminster Abbey on April 29, 2011. This documentary was produced in the weeks following the announcement of their engagement.